if you haven't already read the newsletter about Roy and his writings and his career and his background and this subject, then you need to do it. There's also a review by Kurt Bench in the newsletter on one of Roy's books on the Lost Canyons of the Green River, The Story Before Flaming Gorge, that you should all read. So welcome, Roy, as our distinguished speaker tonight. Welcome to everybody else here. Why don't we go around and introduce guests, and then we'll have a few announcements, and then we'll get to what we came for. Who is visiting or who has visitors with them?
Well, I have a guest, my colleague and friend, Catherine McKay. Catherine and I have known each other for a few years.
Yeah, one or two.
From graduate school up through colleagues on the history faculty at Weber State. It was a pleasure all through those years. Catherine has expressed interest in joining our group, and I'm looking forward to sponsoring her at the appropriate time. So Catherine, it's good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see all of you.
Welcome, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who else?
This is Frank Pester, a new member.
Yeah, and I was going to introduce you in a minute, Frank. Please go ahead, though.
I have a friend with me, Jeff Hunt, who works with me up in preservation at the Marriott Library.
Great. Thanks, Frank. And I'll say this right now. Sorry, I should have said it first on. We have two new members. We have Frank Preston. We have Ian Wright, who were both unanimously made members by the board this month. Welcome, welcome. You'll get your little your antelope heads eventually when we meet together, and it's great to have you as part of Westerners. Now, sorry to interrupt. Let's keep going on visitors.
So Kent, this is Scott Snow.
Please.
I have a friend, Kim Bond, who's with us. And I think also iPad is Jeff. Is that Jeff from Sam Weller that I invited? I'm trying to identify him. It doesn't have his name, but I think
yeah, that was Frank. I'm Frank. Jeff's
my Frank. I'm sorry, Frank.
Yeah, but you met me at Weller's.
So you've become a member. That's awesome. I had a great experience with Frank, and he sold me some great books at a discount, of course, and I've always appreciated that. But the two of them I've invited, and I think Vaughn Whitby, who I've submitted for membership, will also join us. He might be a little late.
Cool. Thank you. Welcome all. Who's next?
I have a couple of guests. I have my wife, Becky, behind me, Rebecca, and my daughter, Rachel, as I said, is my tech advisor who teaches first graders via Zoom. And so she can help me out. And my other daughter, Sarah, who is here, and as I said, just came back from Moab and is, I'm glad she's able to join us. I also asked Candace Cravens, who's the director of the John Wesley Powell River History Museum in Green River, to join. I don't see her yet, but since all of it takes place in Green River and Moab, so she might join us later.
Thank you, Roy. It's wonderful to have your family here, your daughters and your wife, and your other guests. Thank you. Welcome to all. Who else is? This is great. We're getting lots of fun, interesting people for these presentations every month. Who else is visiting? We got it? I know there's more, but it's okay. You don't have to introduce yourself. We're not going to make you. Anybody else want a last chance to introduce a guest? Okay. So last week I received in the mail this. We got an award from Westerners International, a group with which we have an interesting, sometimes uneasy relationship. And it is the Westerners International 2020 Heads Up Award for Best Smaller Corral or Posse. I bet nobody knew we were a smaller corral or posse, but that's what we are. And the note from Lonnie McDonald, you know, it's funny because heads of corrals and posses are called sheriffs. So technically I'm a sheriff, even though I don't really like to think of myself as a sheriff. But the Bonnie McDonald, who's the head of Westerners International, is the chairman of Westerners International. So I don't know how that fits together with sheriffs, but this is what Bonnie said. Dear Ken, congratulations to the Utah Westerners for this year's award, and thanks to all your members for their impressive participation. Here's hoping that 2021 will soon make it easier for host programs for all of us, to host programs for all of us. So I think the reason we came to their attention is that we have managed through all of your efforts and participation to continue to meet monthly with wonderful speakers, and everybody on my TV screen, on both of my TV screens, deserves a big applause. And thank you all very, very much for everything you do. Be sure to read the newsletter. There's always so much in there. Steve Berlin does such a nice job on this. This month, we've got a wonderful introduction to Roy's presentation and to Roy himself. We have links to interesting things to read and do. For example, a fascinating column by Hal Schindler about the Utah War and the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and other good things. For your information, the 2020 directory, which is very helpful to find people with phone numbers and email addresses and addresses, is published thanks to Nelson Wadsworth and Steve Berlin. It's a big job, and Nelson does a spectacular job and has for a long, long time. And with a little bit of help from Steve and Jan Berlin, we've managed to pull it off again. Some of you may not have received it yet. We'll send it to you as soon as you pay your dues. Another plug to pay your dues. We just need to keep going, and we appreciate that most people have now paid their dues. In addition to that, Laura Baer is very close to being done with the 50-year anniversary history of Utah Westerners, which is going to be spectacular. It's going to be a trip down memory road, even for those of us who don't have that long of memories in Westerners. I note there's a link in the newsletter to a lecture being given by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich at Dixie State University. It's the Juanita Brooks annual lecture. It's on March 25th. We can all attend by Zoom. Another fun thing about Zoom. Laurel, I assume most of you know, many of you know, or at least know who she is. She's the 21st century professor of history at Harvard University. She's a winner of Pulitzer Prize for her book, A Midwife's Tale. The famous originator of the phrase, well-behaved women rarely make history, which after she coined it and went on everybody's bumper stickers, she also wrote a book by the same name. She recently published a book called The House Full of Females, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism, 1835 to 1870, published by Penguin Random House. She's going to be presenting in St. George on the murder of a woman named Olivia Coombs in Cedar City in the late 1850s, the conviction of her murderer, and the pardon of the murderer by Brigham Young 3 years later. It's a horrifying, fascinating, compelling tale. I actually had the privilege of reading a draft of it because she wanted to talk to me about some of the legal and extra legal components of the thing. And so it's going to be really interesting, as only someone like Laurel can make things. With all that, there are other announcements you should look at in the newsletter. Again, I appreciate everything everyone does. I have a high hope that within a not too distant future, we can actually be meeting in the Alta Club together, which has the benefit not only of continuing the same kind of presentations, but having actual interhuman personal contact with each other, which is nothing but good. So with that, I'm going to ask Walter Jones if he will introduce our speaker this evening, Roy Webb.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, Roy, for suggesting that I introduce you. Roy and I have been friends since 1982 at the Marriott Library. One thing about Roy at the library, he's a scholar, but he was also a good organizer and supervisor, and he moved up the ranks at the library in special collections to curate our division head for multimedia archives. And he really, Now that's the employment side of Roy. The intellectual side is he's a fantastic author and speaker. He's a great speaker, but he's written several books. The first one being the If We Had a Boat, which came out in about 1985 and has had subsequent reprintings, very popular. Now, he can correct me on this. I didn't have his resume to work with tonight, but I think his latest book is the one titled, let me see here, Lost Canyons of the Green River, The Story Before Flaming Gorge Dam. If that's not his latest, it's a very new book and a very popular book. In addition to book-length manuscripts, he's also written a plethora of articles for various magazines, various journals like Utah Historical Quarterly, Blue Mountain Shadows, and he has a great number of interests that occur in these. One, he's been a in-resident soccer history expert. He spoke at the Utah Historical Society on that one. Excellent, excellent article. He knows how to do his research and put it together. We're going to really have a good program from him tonight because he always produces. Other things he's done, in addition to river running and Utah soccer, he's researched Utah cattle raising. He's also researched the Pony Express stations to Utah. So he has a variety of good, solid research expertise. And it's my pleasure to introduce him tonight. So Roy, here you are. We can't give him a big hand, but let's say hello to Roy. Roy, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, now I'm going to share screen. And I'm going to do those things. And is that working?
Yes.
You already see it? Okay. All right. It says you are screen sharing. Yeah, I did. Thank you. My tech support is talking to me here. So, okay. So what we're going to talk about tonight is something you don't expect. We were just talking about this a little earlier, as in Utah history. There was, as I mentioned, this is the first time I ever wrote about this. This is it's called the Museum of Moab now, but it used to be called the Dan O'Lory Museum in Moab, the Canyon Legacy, which is a wonderful journal. I've actually written for them several times and has all kinds of southeastern Utah history, that and Blue Mountain Shadows, which is San Juan County, and they're also very, very good. Okay. Okay. As I mentioned, there were, and we talked about, their paddle wheelers were not unknown in Utah. This one is the city of Corinne, which operated on the Bear River and the Great Salt Lake in the 1870s when the lake was at one of its highest levels. And Ken was just mentioning how for the baseball tournament in 1872, I think he said, that all the people between Corinne and Salt Lake, all the people who wanted to go to the game rode the city of Corinne. And it lasted several years. I think once the lake started to fall, of course, it couldn't handle it. So there was some other attempts too. This is on the Upper Green. This is the Comet, which ran on briefly on the Green River between Green River, Wyoming and Linwood, Utah. And they would go downriver. There were a lot of ranches in Linwood, a lot of sheep raising. And they would go downriver and stop at the Buckboard Hotel, which was halfway between. And for $5, there was a fare there and back. It was a 60 feet long and 12 feet wide, had a beam of 12 feet and had a gasoline-powered stern wheeler, but it was just too big for the shallow green, that upper part. Even though the water's flat, there's just not enough of it. There were a couple other little ones too. One called the Teddy R, which was named for Teddy Roosevelt. That was a little steam launch. and the Sunbeam, which again was just never worked. And it was finally moved up to Fremont Lake in the Wind River Mountains and became an excursion craft. So the first attempt on the Green, and one of the reasons that people talked about it was the road between Thompson Springs, which is where you catch the railroad, and Moab was terrible. It was 30 miles of just ruts and rocks. And at one point you had to, if you ever notice when you go into Moab, right, as you're driving down through the last canyon, and then you're coming to the entrance to Arches, there's a great big ridge there. That ridge was torn out for the highway. Used to, if you wanted to go between Moab and Green River, you had to haul your wagons up over that ridge. And so anybody who tried to go was bruised and dusty. Moab was growing a lot of fruit, and they wanted to be able to ship it. But by the time they hauled it up to the railhead at Thompson Springs, it was just pulped. And so people got the idea, travel by river was a way of life in a lot of parts of America. And why not try it on the Green of the Colorado? They could look and see the river was flat, calm, and they knew there were no rapids. So the first one was a guy named B.S. Ross, who was from Wyoming. He wanted to build a hotel at the confluence of the Green and the Colorado rivers at Spanish Bottoms. And so he bought this boat in Illinois, and he shipped it to Green River and named it the Major Powell. But it drew 2 feet of water. It was a round bottom boat, drew 2 feet of water. And the first time they tried it, it only made it as far as the mouth of the San Rafael River, which is about 20 miles downstream, and hung up on a sandbar. So they left it there until April of the next year. And then him and another guy named Edwards came back, they repaired it, and the water was quite a bit higher, and they were able to get all the way down to the confluence. But when they tried to go back, the water was so high that they could barely make it. And they got back, they couldn't make it against the flood. So they tried, after that point, gave up on it. This William Edwards guy bought it and did some modifications. It took a month to go downriver and back, so he got disgusted. It was tied up on the riverbank and abandoned, and it was stripped of its engines and boiler. The first kind of successful one was the Undine, which was built by a guy named Frank Summerhill of Denver. Again, it was built in Illinois, and it was shipped in pieces to Green River, and it was 60 feet long, 10 feet beam. It was a coal-burning 20 horsepower engine, and launched in November of 1901. This is the launch of the Undine. And these, there's a lot of photographs of this because these were big news. I mean, the local editor of the Grand Valley Times in Moab was a guy named J.N. Corbin, and he was a real booster of the steamboat lines. And so he would send out a photographer, he would go up and take photographs. And so that's why there's quite a few photos. But when they launched the Undine, the water was so low that they spent most of their time heaving off of sandbars with block and tackle. They finally made it up to Moab on December 9th, 1901. And Summerhill had great plans for making a regular run back and forth. And so he stayed around Moab and was motoring up and down river, just testing it out. Here's the Undine again. But one day they got up to Big Bend, which is, there's a campground there now if you go up Highway 128, the river road, and the Undine came to grief. It got turned sideways, hit a sandbar, turned over, and Captain Summerhill swam ashore. Fireman and engineer clung to the boat as she came rolling sideways down the middle of the river. Boat caught by a hidden boulder in midstream and held fast. Crew taken off by a rescue party in a rowboat. Some of the crew were still clinging to the overturned hull when a guy riding by on the road saw him and went to a mill and was able to get help. But the Undine was lost. They salvaged the boilers and the engine, and that was it for the Undine. The next attempt was called the Wilmot, built by a guy named Edwin T. Wolverton, who was a local rancher in Green River. It's named after his wife, who we see here on the right. That's Edwin Wolverton in the middle there. So this was a smaller boat, 27 feet long, 5.5 foot beam with a 4 horsepower gas engine. It was a stern paddle wheeler, but it was too small, so he put in a bigger engine. And this was the first boat to be successful, making the round trip to the confluence several times and then up to Moab once. Here's the Undine, or the Wilmot. See, it's a smaller boat, but Very, very snappy looking, very sharp. Here's another view of it. So he upgraded the engine again because he wanted to haul freight and passengers, and it actually became a workhorse. He built a couple of big scows, and this is one he called the Turtle, and he would push them with the Wilmot. And he hauled ore from mines downstream, freight, passengers to ranches downrivers, and actually made quite a success out of it. It was the first one that was really successful. But then in 1908, the river froze over. It was caught in the ice and damaged, and so it was abandoned. And again, the engines and everything were salvaged. So Wolverton, here's a couple more pushing a scow with supplies in it. Wolverton took one of those engines and built another, just a small scow he called the Navajo. We don't have any pictures of it. We just got this plan, this profile. But he used it. He was able to go, it was 22 feet long. He was able to haul supplies to his ranch downriver and then all the way down to what they always said, down to the cataracts, which meant down to the head of Cataract Canyon. And so down to the confluence at Spanish Bottoms and then back. And it was very successful. He used it until 1912 and then left the river at that point. But he also built boats for other people, one for another local rancher named Tom Wimmer. This was the Launch Marguerite, and that was named after his Wimmer's wife, again. So Wimmer, this one was 33 feet long. It was a stern wheeler. You can see it here. What's interesting in this is the sand too. I mean, that's something that disappears now, unfortunately. So he had a ranch at the Ruby Ranch, which is right at the mouth of the San Rafael, and he used to haul supplies. Then in 1910, he started his own freighting company, Wimmer Transfer, and in 1914, he got the contract to haul supplies, coal, drilling equipment, food, passengers, horses, engineers, to where the U.S. Reclamation Service was testing for dam sites at the confluence of the Green and the Colorado. And there was, they were actually going all up and down the river, and that was one of the places they were trying. Wimmer also carried tourists and would take his family on excursions in the Launch Marguerite. So Wilmot and Wolverton proved that it was feasible and that you could go up and down the river. So another guy, John Lumsden, got the idea. He wanted to set up a regular tourist run all the way down and then back up to Moab and back. But for that, he needed a much more grand boat. So he had built the city of Moab. Now this had a dozen staterooms, a bath, a saloon, and a generator which provided electric lights. But he kind of made a mistake when he built it and put on propellers instead of a stern wheel or side wheelers. And so the bigger engines, the 230 horsepower gas engines, didn't really do that much good. Here it is being built on the bank at Green River in April of 1905. Here it's getting close to being done. Now all the ladies have come to check it out. Here we are getting ready to launch. They launched it sideways. Here's May 1905. This is the date it was launched. And there it is going downriver. But it only made it to the railroad bridge, which was about a mile downriver, and hit something and got hung up for 2 days. So they finally got it off. And then after that, though, it really didn't get much better from there down because this boat was just too big for the river. So it hung on every sandbar. And they'd get out, block and tackle, heave it off. And then it finally was able to get going and disappeared downriver and disappeared. And it was supposed to be in Moab, and it didn't show up. So this is from the Grand Valley Times of May 19th. So where is the steamer, City of Moab? Great anxieties have been felt among those interested in the steamer City of Moab and the passengers who left Green River on board of her last Friday. The boat not having showed up in Moab. When the party left Green River, it was with the intention of making Moab by Saturday Eve, but those who knew of the difficulties did not look for them until Sunday or probably Monday. When Tuesday came and nothing was heard of the party, their anxiety began to rise. This is Jay and Corbin again, who was a very, very florid writer. So where was it? Here's where it was. Downriver from Moab, about 30 miles on the Colorado in Meander Canyon, is one rapid. It's called the Slide, and that's what it is. It's just a bunch of rocks have slid off into the river, and it's really not much of anything. But by May, they were at high water, and so the water was just too strong, and they tried and tried to get past it, the slide, and finally they're chugging upriver against the current, and the boat suddenly runs out of gas, and it goes careening downriver in the strong current, and finally, luckily, crashes onto a beach and not onto the rocks, and with such force that Captain Anderson, who was the pilot, was thrown out into the river. So at that point, they gave up and decided they were going to go back up to Green River, but the water's in flood, so it was another ordeal. They kept hanging up on sandbars. Everybody had to get out, help push the boat, haul on the block and tackle to get it. Finally, at one point, 3 passengers were able to obtain horses, and they said, "We're out of here," and they left and rode back to Green River. And the rest of them got to the mouth of the San Rafael and hit a sandbar and were there for 2 days trying to get it off. They finally made it to within 7 miles of town, and the engineer was a guy named Haraoki Kapioki, whom we'll see again in a minute. He said they only had one blade on one of the propellers, and the other one, the hub was damaged, and so they just figured that was it. So they tied the boat up and left it. So Lumsden and Anderson, the captain, spent the winter and most of the next summer working on the city of Moab. And what they did was they added 10 feet to the length. They converted it into a steam-powered sternwheeler. They stripped off the cabins and the saloon. They replaced them with an open deck, as you can see, and they renamed it the Cliff Dweller. But alas, for all their hard work, it was no more successful. They tried going downstream again, and they only made it to Valentine Bottom, which is about 60 miles downriver, and couldn't get any farther. They just kept getting hung up, and they finally gave up in disgust and left it. The Lumsden sold the boat to a guy named Mr. Siegmiller from Salt Lake, who was, once they were finally able to get it back upriver to Green River, he sawed it in half, shipped it to Salt Lake City, and used it as an excursion boat on the Great Salt Lake for quite a few years. Here's the city of, or the Cliff Dweller again. What's interesting about this picture, this is one of those panoramas, is this. I cut it in half to show you. You can see, here's a side wheeler. If you can see my cursor. Here's a side wheeler, and this is the other half of the picture. Down here is another side wheeler, and I'm not quite sure which ones these are. And here's a stern wheeler. So there's 4 steamboats, 4 powered boats right there in this picture at Green River, which I thought was very interesting. Here's the Cliff Dweller in its glory. So here's Haraoki Kapioki. He was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and he was actually the engineer on the city of Moab and the Cliff Dweller. He installed the engines. So in 1907, he decided he would build his own boat, which he called the Black Eagle. We don't have any pictures of it, unfortunately, because here's the launch of it in June 1907. But Yoki later wrote a letter to someone. He died in the I think 1950s. He said, "Yes, we had a steamboat blow up or blowout some years back on the lower River Green. I was builder, owner, commander, and pilot of the craft, the Black Eagle of Elgin," which is, Elgin is the east side of Green River. It's called Elgin. The west side was called Blake before the two were combined into the town of Green River. J.A. Ross, fireman, E.J. Cook, engineer. When I didn't have time to monkey with the engine, and a cap, us 4 and no more. Fortunately or unfortunately, we had a water tube boiler and a flood of mud for water. A couple of tubes got plugged with mud, naturally blow out themselves, killing the fire. Thus, we had no powers other than an Armstrong rowboat, plenty of wild meat and scenery for dessert, naturally no rush about getting out. However, if it had been a flue-type boiler, we would be overdue to this day. Just another mysterious disappearance on the high seas of time and destined in a vast port of missing men. So the next guy was a local merchant, a guy named Milton Openheimer. He decided he wanted to get into the business. So in 1909, he built the Patty Ross, What you can see here is a pretty simple boat, smaller. Silver to Woollertons, but it had a powerful engine. It was similar to the Wilmot a little bit. Well, I guess it wasn't, come to think of it. That's what I wrote. Anyway, had a 14 horsepower engine, and it was very successful. He was able to take it up and down the river quite a bit, hauling freight and supplies and passengers. And by this time, there were quite a few ranches had been started in the bottoms down through Labyrinth Canyon and Stillwater Canyon. And so he was able to haul freight. But then one time, on a trip in 1909, one of the valves blew out. So using that ingenuity that early pioneers and steamboaters had to have, he melted down a pewter spoon and was able to build a new valve and was able to keep going. And it ran for the next decade, almost to 1920. Here's the Patty Ross again. So there's another local resident named H. Elwin Blake Sr., who was a typesetter and newspaperman. He wanted to build his own, so he built a little boat called the Ida B. And again, Ida B. Barker, that was his wife's name, and so named for her. But inspired by that success, he built a larger craft he called the Utah. And they made it. Oh wait. So here's a story that happened with him. Move this thing out of the way. There we go. He built this Utah. He took a party down the green on a scenic tour. He also brought along his son, H.E. Blake Jr., whom, if you have heard of the big USGS surveys in the 1920s, H.E. Blake Jr. was a boatman on just about every one of those, on the Trimble survey, the Wooley survey, and the others, and then the Grand Canyon, the big Grand Canyon survey. He says, after leaving Anderson Bottom, suddenly there was Anderson Bottom is in Labyrinth, it's below Mineral Bottom, so it's in Stillwater Canyon. He says, suddenly there was a clatter and bang that caused Dad to shut the engine off abruptly. As the connecting rod caps were removed, it was found that everyone had burnt out. So Blake Sr. was able to find clay in the riverbank that he used to make molds, melt down the broken caps, and reform them successfully. It took him several times, and they would keep redoing it, but he was finally able to get it done. At last, the result seemed to please Dad. By the time the engine was in place, another day was drawing to a close. Nevertheless, a trial was made to see if the engine would run. It did, and all slept, some no doubt with a prayer of thanks on their lips. The run to the junction of the rivers was made without a stutter from the rejuvenated engine. And then they were able to go all the way up to Moab, and they picked up a load of 1,000 pounds of peaches. But by the time they got back to Green River, they had all spoiled. Whoops. So the next one that actually into the 1920s was the Baldwin brothers in Moab. They had the Moab Garage Company, which was right there on Main Street across from where Back of Beyond Books is now. And this comes from an article in the spring 1964 Historical Quarterly. So there was Virgil, Dennis, and Clarence Baldwin, and they were on the river from 1925 to 1930. They built several smaller boats, but then once oil was discovered downriver from Moab, they built a big boat. It was and it never had a name. It was just named Moab Garage Company on the bow. It was 75 feet long. It had a 15-foot beam, a 40 horsepower Ford car engine, and an 8-foot paddle wheel, and it cost them $7,000 to build. But it was very successful. It was also equipped with 12 tons. It could carry 12 tons of freight, equipped with a capstan and 500 feet of steel cable to haul off sandbars. Sorry. Sorry about that. Sorry. Okay. I should have turned that off. Let's see, back to present. Okay. So here's, these are just a bunch of pictures of the Moab Garage Company. The first boat they built was, one of the first was called the, I don't know who this is. So it's right there by my chair. So sorry about that. All right. Okay. Should have thought of that. Okay, so these are just some pictures of the Moab Garage Company boat being used. Here it is in just a nice view of the canyon below the portal. So from downriver from Moab. Here it is hauling a huge boiler. This is actually a different boat, one of the other scows they had, but it's hauling this huge boiler down to one of the mines downriver, or one of the oil wells. Here they are. You can see up in the upper right corner, or upper left corner, I'm sorry, you can see the Wagon Bridge, or the new bridge in Moab. And they're just, this is actually right around the same place that, if you're familiar with Moab, the Canyonlands by Night hotel and everything is right around this, right where this is now. Here they are. Moab Garage Company. Actually, there's one of these that has horses on it. They were hauling horses down to be used as pack horses, I guess. They also use it for excursions. Here's a bunch of people, dressed in their finest, going out on an excursion. Here's a good look at the stern of it, the 8-foot paddle wheel. And this is heading, again, up toward the bridge, and then they would go downriver, turn around and go downriver. This is one of their smaller boats that they use. I always like this picture just because all the ladies in their nice hats and the guys in their boaters there. And so obviously on some kind of excursion they're going to. So what oil was discovered was really more like tar sands, and it was in shallow wells. One of the oil wells was called Schaefer No. 1, and they hauled between June 1925 and June 1927, when the wells were abandoned. The Big Scow and the other boats made over 240 trips between Moab and the wells, and they could go downriver, which is about 30 miles, and then back up in a round trip in 9 hours. Virgil Baldwin estimated that by the time the wells shut down in 1927, they'd made over $250,000. So pretty lucrative for them. But then in December 1925, the Schaefer No. 1 caught on fire. And, with those old, those wooden derricks like you see here, of course, that all burned up totally. And it took them a while, they had to dump all kinds of stuff down the hole to get it out. And after that, they figured it just wasn't worth it. And the wells, they worked at it for another couple of years. There was a Schaefer No. 2 just downriver, and then that was it. They were abandoned. Whoops.
At mile 47 on the right bank, we stopped to see the remains that had been left by the Moab Garage Company in their oil drilling operations. They were founded in 1917 and drilled oil at this point. Found some oil, of course, and it's still there. They built several small buildings and even operated a boat, which was called the Moab Garage, into the 1920s. This is Schaefer Well No. 1, and the boat, the Moab Garage, made several hundred trips down here during the 1920s, carrying oil and equipment back and forth to the town of Moab. And that's the remains of the old boat, the 75-foot boat there.
This was, film was made on a survey for the Glen Canyon salvage surveys. And that one picture earlier showed Dr. Crampton, Gregory C. Crampton. And that voice I'm sure you all recognize was Bud Rusho. He went along with Don Harris and Jack Brennan of Harris Brennan River Expeditions, took them downriver with another man whose name I can't remember, to look at historical sites down the river as part of Dr. Crampton's work with the salvage surveys.
Here at mile 39.5 on the right bank are the remains left by another early oil drilling venture. This is probably what is known as Schaefer Well No. 2. And there are some rather heavy bits still around there. These wells are pretty shallow. Mostly they drilled into what we would call tar sands today, and the oil just rather oozed to the surface. We decided against transporting this bit back down to the boats.
Well, Mike, after 4 days of it, said
Here
anybody
at
doesn't
mile
want to get the
39.
shot is nuts.
So those great big bits were all transported by the Moab Garage Company. Imagine the work on there. So, okay, that's somebody talking.
So did he have the surgery? Was he gonna have to go back to Seattle?
They don't know yet.
Yeah. Somebody needs to, if they would please. Thank you. There's still quite a few remains of the steamboat era in Green River and elsewhere. This is kind of the major one. This is a cabin that was made from the city of Moab. You can see the picture on the right. Notice the upper cabin. This is the city of Moab as it was first built. And then look at the house to the left. This is in, and here we know that it was there by 1910. Here's a photo, the dedication of the Wagon Bridge in 1910. And if you look at the house that's circled here, you can maybe see the cursor. There's the sign from the Cliff Dweller. They salvaged the sign and they made a house into it. Later on, additions were added on the sides and on the back, and there was other stuff built around there. But we know it was in place by 1910. Here's the location if you're familiar with Green River, if you ever drive through there. Here's the John Wesley Powell River History Museum. And here's the state park over here on the left, the golf course, and the arrow is pointing to the house. It's on the old, and this actually Elgin Avenue was originally the road where the old bridge was. It's been torn down since. And then the freeway bridge is farther downriver. Here's the railroad bridge, but this would have been the old bridge. So this was really close. This whole area in here, I think on both sides of the river, is where the boats were built and launched. And so I don't think anybody's ever done an archaeology survey, but I bet you would find all kinds of stuff over in there. Here's another view of the cabin. And what kind of clued me onto it was a local person told me that's what they thought it was. So I started looking at it. I noticed the arrangement of the windows. There's 2 windows and then a door, which here is boarded up, and then 3 more windows. And if you go back and look at the picture of the city of Moab, there's that same arrangement. So, and I've talked to a woman whose late husband was, his family lived there. They had 12 kids that lived there and in this other little house made out of railroad ties over here on the right. And they called it the Ant Ranch. And they weren't sure. She told me that Kapioki had given her husband the house, but Yoki died well before the husband came along. So I'm not quite sure what happened there, but still I'm working with the city to obtain it for the city's going to build a kind of a recreation area right in here. They own all this property right in here and they want to put in a playground and walking trails and that kind of thing. And I'm working with the city to try to get it included into that. And then we would clean it up and put in interpretive signs and all that kind of thing. And so, and then hopefully I'd like to get it onto the National Register because it's utterly unique. I mean, I don't think there's another place like it in the entire state. Here's some other details of it. See those windows and the door. There's other things too. Here's on a different property, which we'll see in a sec, was this shaft. And so I wondered if this is the reason it started me thinking that is because it was Kapioki's house. This is on the guy on the right on the porch is Kapioki, Haraoki, who was one of the early steamboaters. So if you look at these things, that this rod, the one on the left, is 12 feet long. That the center is about 1.5 inches around, and it's solid iron. And I have no idea how much it weighs, but it weighs a lot. You know, a couple of us got on one end and tried to shift it, and we couldn't even budget. And so I sent this picture, the one on the right, to I looked up a bunch of steamboat museums back, in the Midwest and back east, and sent it off to a bunch of people. And one guy responded and said, yes, indeed, that's exactly what that is. It's a shaft at a paddle wheel. I don't know whether it was a stern wheeler or a side wheeler, but that's what that is. And so that's some remains. These are on, this house is privately owned, and we're trying to get the owner to donate those shafts and either move them to that, to the City of Moab house or over onto the museum grounds. Here's the Elgin Cemetery, which is, if you go on the Hastings Road, the one that goes up toward Nefertiti and to Swayze's Rapid and the boat ramp and everything there, it's off on the right. And there's quite a few. I mean, Pearl Baker is buried there and others, but one of the early steamboaters is also buried there, Edwin T. Wolverton, builder of the Wilmot. Many of these early steamboaters marked their journeys with inscriptions in Labyrinth and Stillwater Canyons on the Green, and they went all the way down to the confluence of the Green and the Colorado at Spanish Bottoms. And they're all kind of faded, and brush has been rubbing against them, and so they're some of them are barely legible, but you can still find traces of them. Here's the oldest one from the Major Powell, and they had put the township and range on this, so that's how you know where it is. The steamer Major Powell. Here's the Patty Ross from 1907, a couple of different ones, October 11th and then November 1907. Here's one from 1909, the Launch Marguerite, Wimmers. This is another little example. There's a model of the cliff dweller in the John Wesley Powell River History Museum in Green River. And thanks to Candace Cravens, who's the director, who sent me these pictures today, because I just thought of it. And we were trying to think who built this, and I actually don't know. And so we're going to do a search through the papers down in the Green River archives and see if we can figure out who built this model. But it's a really nice, very pretty model. So this is what the cliff dweller would have looked like in its heyday. So instead of the vast commercial and manufacturing empire that editor of the Grand Valley Times, J.N. Corbin, envisioned, Moab now bids fair, in his felicitous phrase, to become a center of tourism. Instead of steamboats that were chugging and puffing up and down the river, hauling the fruits of commerce, an industry financed by men of capital, again, as he would have said, today the most common craft are inflatable rafts that carry thousands of passengers down to the very cataracts that the early steamboaters so dreaded. Commercial river running forms a large part of the economies of both Moab and Green River, and perhaps editor Corbin would have been pleased after all. Here's another example. This was built in 1972 by Tex McClatchy, the Canyon King. And he ran it up and down all around Moab, just up to as far as he could get in all through the 1970s. And as you can see, it would carry hundreds of people. Then it was later moved to Lake Powell, where it operated for a while. And now it's been dry docked and land, and it's become a pizza place in Page, Arizona. But there's still examples of this going on. The Canyonlands by Day and Night tours, which are right as you get into town, just before you go over the bridge. And they run a lot of tourists, thousands of tourists every year. Up the one on the right is their Canyonlands by Night, where they go upriver from their place. And then they used to have lights mounted on the boat. Now they have a truck that drives along the river road, these huge high-powered lights, and they blast the lights and they tell these stories and play music and all kinds of things. And then they also do little tours downriver in smaller boats, and they'll jet downriver and take you down 10 or 15 miles and then back up. Okay, I think that's all, folks. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we're back. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, I think it's only 7:50. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. I'm not muted.
No questions, Roy, but a comment. In the 1960s, I was boating editor for the Salt Lake Tribune, and the Salt Lake Tribune, the Moab and Green River people talked to Gallivan, the publisher, into promoting the Canyon Country Marathon.
Oh,
Speedboats would race from Green River to Moab, and the Tribune would give great trophies. And then, as a supplement to that, there was the annual Friendship Cruise. They'd get 500 or 600 boats going down from Green River to Moab, and they'd haul your trailer and vehicle over to Moab for, I don't remember what it was, but I did that trip quite a few times, and it was a great trip down at Anderson Bottom. It was a big party every night. Some people from Green River brought in a band, and they played cowboy music, and some enterprising guy from Grand Junction set up a big tent and sold beer, and he called it Carl's Bad Tavern. And he made a lot of money doing that. And I got to run the Green Colorado with a Bill Howland, the Howland family out of Green River. And he would tell me stories of how, as a young man in the 20s and 30s during the Prohibition, he would run liquor from Green River to Moab at night because he knew the river so well. He could navigate the sandbars by moonlight, and he made a lot of money for those days running liquor from Green River to Moab. And then one other quick story, I'm writing my story at the Friendship Cruise in the cafe in Green River, and somebody approaches me and says, "Are you a news guy?" And I says, "Yeah." He says, "How would you like to meet the Duke?" And I said, "I don't know who's the Duke." And he introduced me to John Wayne. And John Wayne was there making a movie. And I'll be darned, he comes walking up to me, and he's about 10, 15 feet away from me. And he looks at me, and I'm in my shorts. And he says, "My God, those are the ugliest knees I've ever seen." And I have a photo of me and John Wayne. He's one of my favorite mementos. Anyway, quick story. Thank you, Roy. Nice job on that presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, that's something I've been planning to do research on, is the Friendship Cruise and the Canyon Country Marathon. Dr. Hatch has some film of that. He was on it, and he showed me some, he might have showed them at Westerners too, but he had some 8mm home movies he'd taken of a little bitty boat with a great big outboard that they built, and they participated in that and ran up and down during the Canyon Country Marathon. So I think it's a fascinating subject, and that what finally killed it off was the late 1970s, a lot of real low water years. There were several years where you could barely get a boat down. One of the things they always had to worry about was people going to Anderson Bottom, and they get drunk, and then they flying down river, and they had a great big sign that said, "Go left, don't go right." But they'd miss that sign, and they'd end up shooting down to the right and end up in Cataract Canyon.
Right.
You're no life jacket, and you're drunk, and you're in a little runabout, and they would just get destroyed. And there were actually a couple of drownings where one guy just disappeared, another person was died, and others were injured, and so on. But I heard a lot of stories about it. It always sounded like a really, really fun time.
Roy, I really appreciated your chronicle of all of these heartrending series of events that just failed. One thing though, do you know why the Patty Ross was so successful? Was there something in the engineering of that boat?
I think the stern wheeler was really adapted. It was a smaller boat, and it was also it had a shallow draft, and it had a more powerful engine. Most of the engines these guys were running on stern wheelers would be 7, 8 horsepower, but he had a 14 horsepower engine, and maybe, I don't know exactly why. I couldn't find anything else about Milton Openheimer, just the name, and that he was a merchant. But I don't know why. And he ran that boat for a decade, and then finally it was just abandoned, and is probably rotting away somewhere in the bush around Green River. Okay, anyone else? If not, again, thank you very much. And if you look for that, the Canyon Legacy, that 1990 issue, you can find it in, like Back of Beyond has copies of it. They might still have copies from the museum, but that's where I've written about it.
Roy, Ed Fraughton here.
Yes.
Do you know the name Otis Marsden, and whether or not he was involved in any of that part of the river activity?
Not really. I'm very familiar with him. His collection at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, is sort of the mecca for Colorado River historians. You can't write about Colorado River history if you haven't been to the Huntington. And it's a very posh private library where you have to apply, you have to get letters of recommendation. I got mine from Dr. Crampton and Dr. Madsen, and I've written letters of recommendation. Marston he was up and down the river quite a bit. I mean, he was up on the Green. He ran Cataract Canyon, but he spent the majority of his time in the Grand Canyon. That was his real big thing. And then later on, he started out with Norm Neville's, running Norm's cataract boats on his commercial trips, and they had a falling out. And then by 1950, Marston had got the idea that power boats like runabouts, either outboards or inboards, were the way to go through the Grand Canyon, where you could just blast downriver and in 4 or 5 days. And so he was called the guru of gasoline. And they would go downriver and stash gas there was all these huge driftwood piles at the time. These driftwood piles were left over from the Pleistocene, and they would be half a mile long, 30 feet high, just gigantic piles of driftwood where there was a curve and the wood would fetch up. And so Marston would stash his gas in those. And then this was late, once he had started trying to do upruns. He got the idea he wanted to be the first person to go upriver from Lake Mead up through the Grand Canyon all the way to Lee's Ferry. Well, one time it turned out that Norm Neville's, this is before 1949 when Neville's died, and Marston was already doing this. So he had stashed a bunch of gas, like 50 gallons of gas in one of these things. And so one of the other things that Neville's liked to do, just like most boys, was set things on fire. And they justified this by saying that, this is going to keep the wood from going down into Lake Mead and jamming up the intakes. So they would set these driftwood piles on fire, and they would burn for days, weeks. They would these huge blazes. So one time, Neville's and a guy named Frank Maisland, if you ever heard of Maisland Carpets, he was the owner of that. He was a big, loyal friend of Neville's and went on a lot of his trips. So they set this driftwood pile on fire, and they're standing there, and then all of a sudden, kaboom! This whole thing just went up in this huge conflagration because it reached that 50 gallons of gas that Marston had stashed there. Marston claimed he did it to sabotage him, and on and on. But he did spend most of his time. He finally was able, they met up with a guy from New Zealand, a guy named Ian Hamilton, who built jet boats. They have a jet instead of a propeller. They'd suck water in and then blow it out at real high speed, and they're real shallow draft. And that's what they still use too. And this was the first time. So he brought 4 of those over, and in 1960, they were able to finally make it all the way upriver in those jet boats, not without, one guy in Lava Falls, he hit a wave and came down so hard he broke his leg, had to be evacuated. And another guy named Don Neff was on a trip, on a Mexican expedition trip at Phantom Ranch. And he said, here they came. And they're all circling around. Yay, we've almost made it. Phantom Ranch is about 80 miles upriver to Lee's Ferry. And they were all happy, yay. And they went flying upriver. And in Grapevine Rapid, which is about 6-8 miles upstream, one of the boats, there were 2 big ones and 2 little ones. One of the little boats hit a wave, flew up in the air, and went straight down, disappeared. And, they lost a lot of their film and their food, and they were much chagrined. And right after that, the Park Service said, no more upruns. We're done with that. So yeah, Marston is a very well-known figure in Colorado River history. And as I said, if you're going to write about Colorado River, you've got to go to the Huntington Library and go through his vast collection of stuff.
Did you ever meet Otis?
I never did. I corresponded with him when I was first starting out. He was still alive, and I corresponded with him a couple of times, but never met him.
Well, he was a great character, and he wore Coke bottle lenses that were so thick you wondered if he ever lost those things on the river. You wouldn't expect a guy like him to be a river runner, but what a guy. So I was lucky to meet him before he died.
Yeah, he was a character. He'd been a submarine officer before World War I, and then during the war he never went. He was on the West Coast, but
But thanks for a great presentation, Roy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Right. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
This was great. This was eagerly anticipated, and you more than pulled it through.
Thank
Roy,
you.
thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Always pleasure to talk to the Westerners.
Absolutely. Thank you. So next month, mark your calendar. April 20th, we're going to have David Igler, who teaches at UC Irvine. He's written a fascinating book called The Great Ocean Pacific Worlds from Captain Cook to the Gold Rush, in which he explores the commercial, social, and ecological transformation of the early 19th century Pacific, which is part of the West, right? We're thinking. Some of you may have known him. He taught at the University of Utah for 3 or 4 years in the early 2000s. And that's who we're going to have come speak next month. Who's going to be, should be fascinating. So any parting words anyone needs to leave with us?
Get your vaccine.
Get your vaccine. Yeah, no, please. And my last one's Thursday, and I can hardly wait. So
we can meet again.
So we can meet again, and that, I'm looking so forward to that. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you,
and
Roy.
I'll see you
Thank you,
April
Roy.
20th.
Nice
Thank
job,
you.
Roy.
Thanks, Roy.
Thanks, Roy.
Bye-bye,
Thanks,
Roy.
Good job, Roy.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks.